Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? Thank you for joining us. Welcome. I am Valerie Williams, the OSEP Director, OSEP being the Office of Special Education Programs. We are very excited today. This guidance that has just come out has been a long time in the making. Many conversations have been had both in and outside the department about how we can be more helpful to the field. And so this is our effort to deal with a number of things that we have seen emerging. Next slide, please. Perfect. So on November 20th, which was very recently, this guidance was released. It would not surprise me if a number of you have not yet had a chance to dive into it, read it, but that's okay because we're going to go over the highlights with you as well as provide some very useful information. You already know this is being recorded. You'll be able to refer to it in the future, share the link with anyone that you think would benefit from it. And we will be talking about this guidance for quite some time because we endeavor to be supportive to the field. Next slide, please. So on our panel today, we have a number of different people. We have Glenna Gallo-Wright, the Assistant Secretary of OSERS, as well as Adam Schott, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, or OESE. We also have Lisa Fox, who's at the National Center on Pyramid Model Innovations, and Brandy Simonson from the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, or PBIS. So before we get going, we like to find out who we're talking to. So a Zoom poll is going to pop up on your screen. We want to know who's in the audience, what hats you are wearing. Many of you are probably wearing multiple hats, and that's okay. But what is the primary hat that you're wearing? So if you could click on a role, you get one choice. We would greatly appreciate it. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. All right, close the poll, please. Okay, very interesting. So it seems that the majority of the people here at the moment are in the specialized instructional support or related service provider field. But there seem to be also a lot of people that fall into district administrator and other category, which we believe is probably a catch-all. So perfect. This is very good. This helps us out tremendously. So we're going to be sharing, like I mentioned, some highlights of our guidance. And we're going to start off with a panel of Glenna Gallo-Wright and Adam Schott. So Glenna and Adam, I want to know if you can share with us the purpose of the guidance, why the department issued it, and equally as important, why is it jointly authored by OSERS and OESE? So Adam, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks so much, Valerie. So let me start by saying that this guidance and today's webinar, they're important in their own right, but they're also part of a broader approach following the Secretary's charge that we use every authority possible. So that's funding, guidance, technical assistance to enable student well-being and drive academic recovery. And we hope that that approach has come across over the past 4 years. We hope you've experienced that commitment through the $122 billion in American Rescue Plan funds that got schools reopened and restored educator jobs that were lost during the depths of the pandemic. We hope that approach has been evident in the way we've pushed states to maintain their own investments in education, to guard against the type of fiscal cliff that we saw 10 years ago after the Great Recession. And we hope the approach has been reflected in both the design and the delivery of the guidance and the training that OESE and OSERS jointly author and deploy to support our most vulnerable students and communities. Look, we've got 30 days left in the Biden-Harris administration, and we are committed to using every hour each day to continue supporting the field and your work. I mentioned academic recovery, and I think every panelist on today's webinar, I think every participant in the webinar would agree that a precondition for a durable equitable academic recovery is regular in-person school attendance. But we've got to acknowledge that we are grappling with extraordinarily high rates of student absenteeism, rates that derive from illness, from challenges and perceptions around school safety, housing and transportation barriers. We're even beginning to see the effects of climate change on regular student attendance. But it's also got to be said that a major contributor is school suspension, both in school and out of school. In the 2020-2021 school year, more than 2 million school days, or roughly 14 million hours of instruction, were missed due to suspensions. If you look at the data another way, nearly 1 million kids received at least one in-school suspension, and over 500,000 students received at least one out-of-school suspension. We can go to slide 5. We know that exclusionary discipline disproportionately impacts specific student groups, including students of color, students with disabilities, and that these are some of the same students who experience disproportionate impacts, achievement, attendance, and otherwise from the pandemic. We can go to slide 6. The CDC has called exclusionary discipline an urgent public health problem, and research consistently shows that exclusionary discipline has both short and long-term negative impacts. It naturally increases student absence, but it also contributes to lower achievement rates. It creates family disruption and stress. It increases the odds of a child being exposed to the juvenile justice system, and all of these bear on a student's chances of earning a high school diploma and going on to meaningful post-secondary experiences. So for all of these reasons, exclusionary discipline is a national challenge that impacts students both with and without disabilities. So our guidance and support around functional behavioral assessments are designed, as Valerie said at the top, to provide educators, schools, and the students, parents, and families who they serve one more tool to ensure that we are addressing student behaviors at scale in a way that can maximize consistent attendance and support optimal learning environments for every kid. So that's just a little bit of table setting. I'm happy to now turn it to my friend and colleague, Assistant Secretary Glenna Wright-Gallo.
Thank you so much, Valerie and Adam. And I'm going to jump in here. I really want to emphasize that one of the reasons that Adam and I and our teams co-developed this guidance together, so that it came out of the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education and the Office of Special Education Programs, is because we know that working in silos is not an effective way to address anything in the education sphere, and that it's about working together. It's about using all of the resources and tools that are available to us as parents, as families, as educators, and as community members, and using those to create better systems. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. And I want to talk about what is in the guidance. What does it talk about with what a functional behavior assessment is? So we know that exclusionary discipline is not a behavioral intervention, and that it often results in the behavior reoccurring. So the use of an out-of-school suspension generally does not change student behavior. And we also know that functional behavior assessments are an evidence-based practice that is used to understand the function and purpose of a child's specific interfering behavior and factors that contribute to the occurrence and non-occurrence. The whole point of a functional behavior assessment is identifying that function and the factors that contribute to it so that you can develop effective positive behavioral interventions, supports, and other strategies to either mitigate or eliminate that interfering behavior. We issued this guidance because behavior is repeatedly a top concern that is brought up by educators, families, and educational leaders. And functional behavior assessments, or FBAs, are just another tool in the evidence-based toolbox. On the next slide, we're going to talk about what the research shows. So research shows that functional behavior assessments can be used to understand behavior for students who have disabilities as well as students who don't have disabilities. We also know that function-based interventions and supports are more effective than exclusionary discipline. And if we're going to put our time and effort into something, let's put our time and effort into something that's more effective, that leads to learning and positive outcomes. We know that functional behavior assessments can reduce interfering behaviors and increase skill development. And when they're provided early, they can help reduce the need for more complex interventions later. On the next slide, we also know that the guidance needed to come out, and it was necessary. It was necessary for educators, and it was necessary for families, and it was timely. We had information that shows the evidence-based practices that are effective, that are the most effective, and we were able to use that in developing this. Our guidance hits on 7 main areas that are summarized on this slide. First, it starts with the Dear Colleague letter that was jointly authored by Adam and I. Then it talks about what an FBA is, goes into the common characteristics of an FBA and a behavioral support or intervention plan, the guiding principles to support the effective development and implementation of FBAs and behavior support or behavior intervention plans. Then we have one section in the document that is specific around the use of functional behavior assessments for students with disabilities. That doesn't mean that the rest of the document doesn't apply, but this is where it gets into IDEA specific areas. Then we talk about what sources of federal funding can be used to support functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. And then at the very end, my favorite is a list of resources that are available, whether they're online or they're through a federally funded TA center. And some of the panelists are going to take you into those today. With that, Valerie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Adam and Glenna. Don't go far because I'm going to have you back shortly. But let's dig into this guidance a little bit. So, Lisa and Brandy, can you tell us what it means to have a continuum of function-based support and why this continuum is an effective way to support and address student behavior? Lisa, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you. You can move the slide ahead. Thank you. So I'm going to start and talk about what it means for early intervention and early childhood programs. And on this slide, you see the pyramid model graphic that is depicting a tiered framework of promotion, prevention, and intervention practices, all aimed at promoting the social, emotional, and behavioral development of young children. So our category of universal practices is depicted there in the blue tiers. And we actually start with this idea of function-based support at this level, as we're providing nurturing or responsive relationships with a child and building our partnerships with families. And we think about our environmental arrangements and how they can prevent children from having challenging behavior and, importantly, promote children's development and learning. You know, as we think about this idea of behavior having meaning or function, the translation of that to early childhood is pretty easy because we know in early development, children use eye gaze and facial expression and their reach and eventually words and behavior that adults find challenging to express their needs. And so we teach them communication, social, and behavioral skills by understanding young children's expressions and teaching them a new means for communicating those messages. So for every child in early childhood, we always consider function, what the behavior is telling us, and how we can respond in ways that prevent the child from continuing to use challenging behavior to get their needs met, and how to communicate those needs using a form of behavior that's conventional and appropriate to the context. So in early childhood, we use this idea of function-based support, and we're shifting from being reactive to being proactive. So we seek to identify the why of behavior, really thinking about the current experiences of the child in the environment, but also in consideration of children's past experiences, part of that knowledge that we need. We also think about how we're reacting and interpreting the function by thinking about our biases. We reflect on that as we're doing the detective work of identifying function. Ultimately, the goal in function-based support is to understand the behavior, prevent reoccurrence, and use that understanding of function to inform what are the skills we should be focused on for teaching. So this idea of a continuum, it begins with always being curious about what the child is expressing and what it means. Most often, teachers and caregivers and family members do that informally and on the spot. It's kind of intuitive, right? So if I'm watching a young child in the classroom grab a toy from another child and push the child away, I'm going to think about, how do I teach that child to request a turn, and how do I make sure I have enough materials in that center that the child doesn't need to do that? Other times, so kind of moving up this continuum, I might need to collect some observations and really mull on that, collect some data, and I might mull over that with my team members or with a classroom coach who's supporting me. Or an early intervention, the EI professional might help the family structure their observations, and then together work in partnership to think about, what does the behavior in that context mean? Once we then know in that kind of more informal, we're not yet at a formal functional behavioral assessment, then we think about, how do we change our interactions, our activities, our teaching, so that we can teach children the interaction skills, the emotion regulation skills, the communication expressions, and how to problem solve. And then on some occasions, at that tertiary intervention level, and you see that depicted on the tiered framework, when it's really difficult to get to a place where we're confident we know function, that's when we convene a collaborative team that is guided by a professional who's really skilled in functional behavioral assessment in guiding the development of a support plan. And we begin the process of a formal functional behavioral assessment and behavior support planning. So Brainy, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about what happens in K through 12.
Wonderful. Thank you for providing that really complete description. And on the next slide, we'll talk about what function-based support looks like also in K through 12. So just as Lisa described, we think a lot about a continuum of function-based support, thinking about how to set up teaching and learning environments that set each and every learner up for success. And so on the next click, we'll think about what that looks like in Tier 1, where classroom educators are thinking through how they can use their understanding of behavior as a form of communication, behavior that serves a purpose or function, to really anticipate kids' needs, to set them up for success with a positive, predictable, safe learning environment, how we can teach the social emotional skills that students are going to need to navigate that environment successfully, and how we can respond effectively, understanding that we can do our best with providing specific feedback to students' behavior, but also thinking about the different functions their behaviors may serve, and so allowing them to meet those functions, again, through effective communication skills. In the next click, we'll know that while Tier 1 should be robust and differentiated and set each and every learner up for success, some students are going to need more. And so Tier 2 does not replace Tier 1 in any of our tiered models. Tier 2 layers on top of Tier 1 to better target students' needs and teach more targeted skills to set them up for success. So in Tier 2, we might have teams at the school-wide level considering a group of students who show similar interfering behaviors or similar needs, and think about ways to effectively match existing intervention supports based on students' needs. So they're going to use a problem-solving process that's driven by existing data, but they're considering function in that process. And then, as Lisa mentioned, there will be some students for whom Tier 1 and Tier 2 is necessary but not sufficient. So in the next click, we'll think about schools then designing individualized supports. And as we'll talk about throughout this webinar, those supports are team and data driven. So in Tier 3, we're centering the student and their family as part of that team to drive decisions about informing the functional behavioral assessment, to drive decisions about what behaviors and skills are important in their culture, in their context. And we're involving professionals, both with content expertise for the environment the student's educated in, and deep behavioral expertise to guide the development of a tiered, kind of tier 3 level functional behavioral assessment and behavior support plan. So the logic behind this, I hope, is clear as Lisa and I are talking about this being a way to set students up for success. And on the next slide, we want to highlight that the evidence supports this work. So we have a resource, and Lisa has similar ones for Pyramid, that talk about when we do this well, when we implement the full continuum of function-based support, we see student outcomes improve. So we see students more engaged, we see students less likely to experience exclusionary discipline, we see students' academics start to respond, we see their social emotional skills improve. We also see schools be a place that teachers enjoy working, right? We see teachers start to develop a sense of efficacy. We see teachers being more likely to kind of return to the same school and be engaged. So we see the evidence supporting the tiered framework and infusing that function-based support throughout the full continuum. So thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about the work that we do, and I'll turn it back over to Valerie.
Thank you so much, ladies. I greatly appreciate that. Glenna, if I can have you come back. My question for you is, in thinking back to your teaching and your early parenting days, why were FBAs a useful strategy, and how did they change your approach to teaching? Similarly, as a parent, how did an FBA support your daughter?
Great question, Valerie. And if we could go to the next slide, functional behavior assessments were helpful to me in both roles because they shifted the focus from blaming the child for the behavior to really being thoughtful and proactive around what their behavior was attempting to communicate. So one of the things that we know is that behavior is a form of communication, right? When we aren't able to put it into words. And so being able to really think back to what's causing the behavior, what's the motivation behind it or the function behind the behavior, and then to create a plan to address that behavior is a much more meaningful and impactful way, as well as evidence-based, of getting to the behavior that you want to see. So we laid out the common characteristics of an FBA. And then I'm going to talk kind of about how I used it as a teacher and as a parent. But I think these 4 basic characteristics are key. What's a description of the behavior? Can you describe it clearly, measurably, observable? And are you thinking about the cultural ramifications and making sure that you're not using language that's biased or judgmental? So describing the behavior. Then there's a data collection component. What's going on around the student when they engage in the behavior. And that can be either direct data from observations, it can be indirect data from talking to someone else who observed the behavior, or looking at previous data from academic skills or performances, as well as disciplinary records. Then we have the function-based behavior review, where we really dig into the data. So what happened before the behavior occurred, what happened when the behavior occurred, and what happened immediately after. And a lot of times you'll hear that referred to as the ABCs, which are antecedents, behavior, consequences. And that's one of my favorite methods that I used both in the classroom and as a parent. And then last is the skill development. So what are the skills that the student needs to improve so that they can communicate their desires in a more effective manner than the behavior that's causing the problems? So when I was a teacher, it really helped me drill down into why a student was engaging in the behavior so that I could problem solve effectively and use teaching strategies that got at the root of the behavior. That flexibility of being able to do a functional behavior assessment informally and quickly in the classroom and use it in the minute that the behavior was occurring provided me the opportunity to really differentiate the supports that I used with students according to their specific needs. So for example, if I had a student who was off task, who was creating a disruption, right? Being able to say what had happened right before the student went off task. Did I give them a task that was not a preferred task? Did I ask them to read aloud something that maybe they struggled with and didn't want to have others see, so that that peer attention, they were worried about being embarrassed? When they acted in a way that was contrary to the behavioral expectations, what did I do as a teacher? Did I remove that demand from them so that they were able to escape or avoid it, right? Those are the pieces that go in that good teachers use as part of their bags of tricks and use to address behavior. As a parent, the same skills were very effective. So one of the things I remember the most is my daughter as a kindergartner getting the call no parent wants to get that your child has been misbehaving in classroom, right? And causing a disruption. But rather than just saying like, okay, I'm sorry, she's no longer going to disrupt class, I was able to kind of go into and conduct a functional behavior assessment with the teacher using that indirect observation, asking her what happened before my daughter engaged in the behavior, what happened after, and we were able to identify the skills and the strategies that she could use to reposition her back on task so that she wasn't off task and creating that disruption. So those opportunities really gave me the chance to plan lessons and really intentionally consider those behavioral needs so that I could create an environment that proactively planned for that behavior and provided the supports that the students needed to be successful.
Thank you. That was a mouthful, but that was all very helpful. Not just in your past as a teacher, but also how you use it every day as a parent. If I could have all my panelists come back on the screen, because I have questions for all of you. This guidance includes guiding principles to support the effective development and implementation of FBAs and behavior plans. And so my question is, what are some key considerations for educators and families who are thinking about expanding their use of FBAs and behavior plans? And Glenna, I'll start with you again.
Great. So if we could go to the next slide, I think it's important to remember that functional behavior assessments can be used for any student whose behavior is interfering with learning. A lot of times we heard this myth kind of come back that you could only use functional behavior assessments with students with disabilities, and you could only use it when they had a manifestation determination, right? And that is absolutely not true. We want to use these effective evidence-based practices for any student who needs some additional support and tools to learn how to behave appropriately. That means students with and without disabilities, students with a range of behaviors, and from our youngest learners to our youth, right? We want to make sure that we're using this evidence-based practice efficiently, effectively, and consistently. I also want to make sure that you understand that functional behavior assessments can be included in a tiered framework, like within a multi-tiered system of support, MTSS, or a PBIS framework, where there's a universal prevention tier that has a focus on function-based teaching and learning. There's tier 2 that includes function-based problem solving, and a tier 3, a functional behavior assessment may be conducted to address specific behavioral needs. On the green side to the right, we also know that functional behavior assessments and behavioral plans are strategies that should support a student's access, their participation, and their engagement in the current learning environment. Support inclusive educational practices and provide data that can contribute to a larger body of informal and formal assessments that guide educational decision-making. Brandy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. So in thinking about who can complete an FBA, I think, as Glenna just described, we're talking about a full continuum of support. And so the guidance, I think, has been really helpful to us in identifying a range of experts who can complete that. And I want to mention, and I think we're still on the prior slide, I want to mention, as I already said, FBAs are a team-driven and data-driven process. So while we're going to talk in a second about the expertise being skilled professionals, it also has to include and center the student and the family. It has to include the educators in the context. And then in terms of the skilled professionals, depending on the complexity of the plan and the complexity of the need, the folks working toward function-based support would include general and special educators, early childhood providers, specialized support personnel. It might include behavior specialists or behavior analysts, administrators who can identify, analyze, and address interfering behaviors. So the guidance, I think, was intentionally flexible because we're thinking about the full continuum of support, and the level of skill and training folks would have would kind of intensify as the level of need intensified. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Sure. So importantly, let's not overlook this because it is so critical that we have to have collaborative partnerships between school or early childhood program personnel and families. And that's for our function-based support all the way to the formalized process of functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention planning. Educators bring the knowledge about the child or the student as they're engaged in learning activities. They know the curriculum, the learning environment, and parents bring all this information about the child, the student, their relationships, their history, their experiences, and importantly, their interests and their preferences and their life in the community. And when we bring that knowledge together in a collaborative partnership, then the FBA and the resulting plan really can lead to meaningful and durable improvements in the student's behavior.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and everyone else who just answered that question. My next question, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper because FBAs and behavior plans originated from addressing the needs of students with disabilities, and the guidance includes an entire section about how FBAs and behavior plans can continue to support students with disabilities. And so, Glenna, can you tell us a little bit about this section?
Definitely. So if we go to the next slide, we know that a goal of the FBA guidance is to foster inclusive learning environments by better supporting the behavioral needs of students with disabilities, right? So we've talked about the fact that this FBA guidance applies to the full range of children from our youngest learners to our adolescents. So now I'm going to talk specifically about how it can support students with disabilities. IEP teams can use the information from FBAs to gain a better understanding of the student's behavioral needs, which can inform the development of present levels of educational performance, right? IEP goals, the special education and related services that may be needed. FBAs can be used as a screening tool to inform instructional practices, similar to how educators use formative assessments to address academic needs and strengths. So when a functional behavior assessment is used in this way, it is the department's view that parental consent is not required. So this is a question that I have seen come up kind of time and time again in the Q&A. When a functional behavior assessment is used by an educator to address educational outcomes, right, in a classroom, it's a tool in their toolbox. They're using it to identify the function of the student's behavior and address us and select a strategy to use to address that behavior. Consent is not required. It is very clear under IDEA that parent consent is required when we are doing evaluations for eligibility under IDEA and in certain other cases. But when we're using it in a classroom with a teacher, with just regular instruction that's going on, that is a process that teachers have been trained on. That doesn't mean that parents should not be involved. We anticipate that teachers and families are going to work collaboratively and have conversations about how to best support the students in the classroom. States may have their own policies, though, about this. So we're giving you the guidance from the federal level. We're talking about what's specific for all students and what's specific under IDEA. And when a functional behavior assessment is used as part of a special ed evaluation as one of the assessment tools used, IDEA does require parental consent in that case. IDEA also says that when you use a functional behavior assessment and it's required to be conducted in circumstances related to discipline procedures, that parental consent would also be required. So I'm trying to lay out the continuum of what's required for students with disabilities, specifically under IDEA, as a response to disciplinary procedures or a special ed evaluation, which would require parent consent and always requires parent collaboration. And on the other side, as a tool that a teacher uses in a classroom to adjust their instruction with any child, students with and without disabilities, does not require consent under IDEA, but there may be a requirement at the state level, and it always should go along with parent collaboration. For a full explanation, I was going to say, go ahead and see the guidance, but go ahead and back to you, Valerie.
Absolutely. Thank you, Glenna. I want to ask all of our panel participants, what advice would you have that you would want to share, advice to educators, families, or any interested party related to the implementation of FBAs and supporting student behavior, whatever that might happen to be? Let's start with Lisa.
Sure. So what I would say is using FBA and function-based support for any child or student with behavior concerns will really empower us, I'd say collectively as educators, to prioritize prevention and address behavior concerns. I think this idea of a full continuum of function-based support all the way to formal FBAs really is transformative. And when we acknowledge that behavior has meaning, that's really at the core of this, we can use that understanding to prevent and to teach. That's what we do as educators, and that can really make a difference.
Thank you. Glenna, what are your thoughts?
So I just want to highlight a couple of things. One is that a functional behavior assessment is an ongoing process, right? We started off by talking about how behavior is a form of communication. And so communication is ongoing, and therefore behavior is ongoing, right? And so this isn't like a one and done, like the student acted out. And so I did a functional behavior assessment, it addressed the issue, and now we've never had to address the issue again. Everything is a part of a process. Instruction is part of a process, and we're all continuous learners and expecting to continue to make progress and grow. So with that, I would say, I'm seeing like who can do a functional behavior in the questions. And so educators are trained. They might need some coaching, that they might have been told this isn't something that they can do before. So that's something that I would talk about at the district level, at the school level, with your state leaders. Like, how is it that we can provide professional learning to really, embed this skill and practice this skill? Also looking at what is the continuum of trying it, if it's not effective, trying it again, looking at, larger conversations with your team, with your families, with the school team, and going back and looking at that. Remember that a functional behavior assessment is a team sport, right? It's not about doing something in isolation. It's about talking with parents, with the children, with your educational team, and remembering that everybody is a key member of the team, and they are able to guide that team to making more progress. So what are the cultural and linguistic things that apply here? What are the unique experiences that they're observing or that they know about? The values and expectations. So how is it that we're really using and leveraging those collaborative partnerships between families and children and schools to create these better supports?
Thank you, Glenna. Brandy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Glenna did such a nice job of describing kind of the role of data, right? She described it as a continuous and kind of iterative process guided by the families and students, and the team is using data to guide that entire process. I think oftentimes when we think about an FBA, we think about the data we collect to inform the FBA. So we think about how we're collecting information on the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences. But there were some questions in chat about, well, what if it doesn't work? And so I think a couple things are really critical to elevate there. One is if you think about what goes into a behavior intervention or support plan, it really is about redesigning the environment and changing our behaviors as adults. The majority of what's actually written into a plan is changes in how we are going to better support the student. And so in thinking about data, then the first thing we have to look at is, are we doing what we said we would do in the plan? So we have to look at our fidelity data to see if we're doing what we intended to do. And then once we know we are implementing with fidelity, we can start to look at, is it working for the student? And that outcome data over time will help us guide decisions about whether we need to adjust support. Maybe we made a mistake in the FBA and we need to go back and collect more data. Do we need to intensify support? Because maybe the plan we developed was not sufficient to meet the student's need. Or maybe the student's being really successful and we can look at ways to fade support and move them back into just needing tier 2 or even tier 1 support, because an FBA should guide the support the student needs to be able to return to more universal levels of support. So I think the role of data becomes really critical as we're doing this entire process.
Thank you so much. And also thank you for taking the time to address some of the, 61 comments and questions, 59 comments and questions that have been dropped in. Greatly appreciate that. Adam, what are your thoughts?
I love what Brandy said about looking at the data, and I think the extent to which the data would substantiate the need to be investing your federal and other funds in professional development to support high fidelity implementation of the guidance would really encourage you to think about that. Also happy to use this guidance to tease some more. So stay tuned. Later this week, the department is going to release guidance on how Title II funding, which this administration has increased by nearly $50 million since 2021. It'll be technical guidance to support districts and states in using those funds to support high quality PD, including induction, training, coaching, other professional learning. So would encourage you to take a look at that, share it widely with your teams. States should push that guidance to their school districts as budget planning for next school year gets underway. And we're always happy to answer questions about that guidance too.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I want to thank the audience and the panelists, but I want to throw a few things in for your consumption. One is that we recognize that the guidance is brand new and just came out, and very few people have had an opportunity to actually dig into it, to actually take a look at it. But please take a moment to do that. What we have done in the last handful of years is made a true and tremendous effort to make sure that our guidance is not 500 pages long, that you do not need a PhD or a law degree to read it, that it is useful, that it is accessible, and something that almost anyone would be able to understand. So we encourage you to print it or sit up late one night if you're having problems sleeping and actually take the time to read the guidance. Because we think it'll be tremendously helpful, and to a certain extent, a large extent, will be self-explanatory. The other thing I wanted to mention is that this is not the first and the last time you will hear us talking about this. We have also made an effort in all the guidance that we have put out in the last handful of years. There was a short and long-term rollout and communications plan. You're not just going to hear about something once and all of us cross our fingers and hope it works. You're going to continue to hear about this. There will be a steady drumbeat. We will be at conferences doing presentations discussing this. There will likely be other webinars. We will be speaking with specific stakeholder groups that might have questions about this. We are going to continue this conversation because we are aware that if you say something once, very few people hear it. But if we continue to talk about something over and over and over again, more people will tend to hear it, have access to it, and even if they don't remember all the details about it, they will remember that something was done and that they will have a general idea of where to start to look for it and how to find the information. So speaking of additional information, there is more information and resources You can visit the website for the Center on PBIS, on the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. Also, the IRIS Center will also have additional resources. And there are some links that are popping up right now for your consumption. So I also have another Zoom poll is going to pop up. We would like some feedback on the webinar. We would greatly appreciate feedback as we go forward and we talk more about this, but this will also help inform our rollout activities in the future. But please, 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 not only participate in this poll, but take a moment to actually read the guidance. We are sure it will be helpful. And so with that, I'm going to leave that up on the screen for a little bit longer, but we thank you very much for your time, your energy, your effort, your participation, all the questions and comments that came through. Now 82 questions and comments that have come through. We thank you for everything that you're doing in the field to help support infants, toddlers, children, and youth with and without disabilities. Thank you so much for everything you do. We greatly appreciate you. Have a good rest of your day and rest of your week.